Good evening, dear friends, and welcome to Watson's Margins. Edward here, glad to find you in this quiet hour. Tell me, is there a lamp burning near you tonight? Perhaps the faint smell of paper, or the last warmth of a cup set aside. These are the hours when the mind settles and sees most clearly. Tonight, we follow Dr. Watson into a house of perfect order and imperfect truth, where reason must move softly and observation must miss nothing. For as Holmes understood, it is not the dramatic gesture but the overlooked detail that speaks loudest of all. Do subscribe to Watson's Margins so no chapter escapes you. Now, make yourself comfortable. For the smallest thing out of place may carry the greatest weight of all. You'll find the Watson's Margins Spotify channel linked in the description below. We'd be glad to have you with us. Chapter 1. The Quiet Order of Blackthorn. It is a curious truth, one that my long association with Mr. Sherlock Holmes has impressed upon me with the force of repeated experience, that the most tranquil of outward appearances will sometimes conceal the most turbulent of inner realities. A man may smile and smile, as the poet warns us, and be a villain still, and so, I have learned, may a house present the face of serene respectability to the world, while nurturing, behind its well-appointed walls, the seeds of ruin and despair. It was in just such a spirit of sceptical appreciation that I first beheld Blackthorn House, on a grey and windless afternoon in the latter days of October, and felt, even before I had crossed its threshold, that peculiar unease which the sensitive observer sometimes experiences in the presence of a scene that is altogether too orderly, too composed, too perfect, in short, to be entirely natural. Holmes and I had departed Baker Street that morning aboard the 9:30 express from Paddington, bound for the village of Wychwood Parva in Oxfordshire, a hamlet so inconspicuous that I confess I had never before encountered its name upon any map I had occasion to consult. The invitation that had prompted our journey had arrived 2 days prior, penned in a precise and somewhat formal hand upon cream-laid notepaper of excellent quality. It was addressed to Holmes alone, though its author had evidently anticipated that I might accompany him, for a postscript, added in a slightly less careful script, expressed the hope that Dr. and Watson would find the country air a welcome restorative after the recent damp of London. I was, I admit, somewhat flattered by the thoughtfulness, though Holmes dismissed the courtesy with his customary brevity. "It is a calculated inclusion, Watson," said he, folding the letter with a precision that matched its author's, and depositing it in the inside pocket of his coat. "Our Mr. Penbury wishes to convey that he is a man of thorough and considerate habit. That is itself a datum." The letter had come from one Mr. Alistair Penbury, the owner of Blackthorn House, who described himself as desirous of consulting Holmes upon a matter of some legal and personal delicacy. The nature of the matter was not specified, and Holmes, contrary to his usual practice of declining vague invitations from unknown correspondents, had accepted with what struck me as uncharacteristic alacrity. When I remarked upon this, he replied only that the handwriting presented certain features of interest, and turned his attention to his pipe and the passing Berkshire countryside, with an air of deliberate finality that I recognised as a signal not to press him further. The village of Wychwood Parva proved to be a modest collection of stone cottages grouped about a Norman church and a single public house, the whole arranged with the quiet permanence of an English settlement that has long since made its peace with the centuries. A trap was waiting for us at the station, driven by a young groom of neat appearance whose livery, though plain, was immaculate. He greeted us with a polite economy of words and said nothing further during the 3 miles of lane that wound between hedgerows and harvested fields to the gates of Blackthorn House. The house itself came into view as we crested a gentle rise in the road, and I confess that my first impression was one of admiration. It was a substantial property of Georgian construction, its pale stone facade symmetrical and well maintained, its grounds kept with a rigour that spoke of permanent and attentive staff. A long avenue of beeches, their branches now stripped of leaf by the advancing season, led to the main entrance, and the rooks that wheeled above the higher chimneys were, it seemed to me, the only irregularity in a prospect of thoroughly composed order. The windows gleamed. The gravel was freshly raked. The creepers upon the east wing had been trimmed to a geometrical precision that struck even my unpractised eye as somewhat excessive. A disciplined establishment, I remarked, as we descended from the trap. Holmes said nothing, but I observed his gaze move swiftly and systematically across the facade, the grounds, the upper windows, and the servants' entrance at the western corner, with the rapid, comprehensive quality that I had long ceased to attempt to imitate, knowing it to be the product of faculties not distributed in the common proportion. We were received at the door by a butler of middle age whose manner was correct to the point of being almost theatrical in its formality, and conducted through a hall of considerable elegance to a drawing-room where our host awaited us. Mr. Alistair Penbury rose as we entered, and extended his hand with the practised ease of a man thoroughly accustomed to the reception of guests. He was perhaps 60 years of age, lean and upright in his bearing, with silvered hair swept back from a high forehead, and eyes of a pale and penetrating grey. His dress was faultless. His face wore an expression of composed welcome that was, I thought, entirely too composed. The expression of a man who has decided in advance precisely what he intends to feel upon every occasion. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, you're most welcome to Blackthorn House." His voice was measured, his enunciation precise. "I trust your journey was not unduly fatiguing." Holmes inclined his head in acknowledgment and accepted the chair that was indicated with the slightly absent air he sometimes affected, when his attention was in fact at its most acute. I settled into the chair beside him and accepted the offer of tea, which was brought with a promptness that further illustrated the house's devotion to seamless order. Penbury spoke for some time of the estate, of the county, of the pleasures of the autumn season in the English countryside, with the fluency and surface charm of a man who has spent many years in society. He touched briefly and without apparent emotion upon his charitable activities, a school in the village, a fund for returning soldiers, contributions to the county hospital, and I formed the impression of a man whose philanthropy, however genuine its effects, was worn as a garment rather than felt as a conviction. Holmes listened with every appearance of polite attention, and I noticed that he had not yet asked a single question. There were others in the house, I gathered from these preliminary courtesies. Penbury's niece, Miss Clara Penbury, a young woman of some 25 years, made a brief appearance during our tea to welcome us, and then withdrew with quiet grace, leaving behind the impression of a self-possessed and rather sorrowful intelligence. Mr. Hargreaves, Penbury's personal secretary, looked in at the door to communicate some domestic intelligence in a low tone, and then retired, the image of professional efficiency. At dinner, to which we were invited as a matter of course, we were joined by Colonel Bryce, a broad, weathered man of some 50 years with the direct manner of a soldier, and the eyes, I thought, of a man who has long been in the habit of calculating the distances and dangers of his situation, and by Mr. Edward Mallory, a younger man whose connection to the household was that of a distant cousin, and who distinguished himself principally by a somewhat overdone heartiness of manner that did not quite succeed in concealing a watchful nervousness beneath. The dinner proceeded without incident. The food was excellent, the wine well chosen, the conversation impeccable. Topics of general interest were raised, examined without excess, and laid gently aside. No voice was raised. No opinion was pressed beyond the point of comfortable disagreement. Everything was, in the most precise and peculiar sense of the word, proper. It was not until Holmes and I had retired to the guest rooms assigned to us, and I had paused at his door to exchange a concluding word before seeking my bed, that I received the first indication that his quiet evening had not been idle. "What did you make of our fellow guests, Watson?" said he from within the room, where he sat in the single chair with his legs extended, and his fingertips pressed together in the attitude I knew so well. "Agreeable enough company," I said. "Penbury is a commanding sort of man. Miss Clara seems reserved but capable. The Colonel is a plain-dealing fellow. Young Mallory struck me as rather too eager to please." Holmes nodded slowly. "They are all of them performing," said he. "And they have been performing for some considerable time. The question that interests me, Watson, is not what each of them is concealing, for that is readily enough discerned in the broad outlines, but why each of them has consented, apparently without compulsion, to remain in a house where concealment is so evidently necessary." I confessed that I had not thought of the matter in quite those terms. "Consider," he continued, rising and moving to the window, where the darkness of the October countryside lay thick and absolute beyond the glass. "This household moves with the regularity of a mechanism. Every gesture is calibrated, every courtesy is deployed. It is not the harmony of happiness, Watson. It is the harmony of mutual restraint, of persons who have agreed, by some tacit compact, to behave as though nothing of consequence divides them." He was silent a moment. "Something holds them here, I intend to discover what it is." I left him at the window and made my way to my own room, where I lay for some time in the unfamiliar dark, listening to the autumn wind move through the beeches of the avenue and reflecting, not for the first time in the long adventure of my friendship with Sherlock Holmes, that the most unsettling places in the world are not those which threaten us openly, but those which smile. Chapter 2. A Man of Questionable Virtue. I slept poorly that first night at Blackthorn House. There was nothing I could name as the cause. The room was warm, the bed was excellent, and the silence of the countryside was broken only by the occasional passage of wind through the beeches and the remote cry of some nocturnal bird. Yet I found myself returning again and again to wakefulness, as a man does when some unidentified disquiet has lodged itself below the level of conscious thought. By 6 o'clock I had abandoned the attempt altogether and dressed quietly in the grey pre-dawn, descending to find, to my surprise, that the fires in the principal rooms had already been laid and lit, the hall already swept, and a tray of early tea set out with silent readiness upon the sideboard. I helped myself and stood at the tall window of the morning-room, watching the mist lie in long flat strata across the park, and reflected that a house which is never quite at rest has something of the quality of a sleeping soldier, always, even in its repose, on guard. Holmes appeared at 7:30, sharp and immaculate in a way that suggested he had not found sleep any more congenial than I had, though he would no sooner admit to a restless night than he would admit to the ordinary requirements of hunger or fatigue. He poured his tea, declined the toast that a maid brought silently and withdrew from, and stood with his cup untouched upon the mantelpiece while he studied the morning-room with the same quiet intensity he might have brought to the scene of an incident. "You've been examining the books," said he, without preamble or greeting. I had in fact drawn my eye along the shelves that occupied the far wall, and had noted their contents in the idle way of a man seeking occupation before breakfast. "A general collection," I said. "History, travel, some poetry. Nothing remarkable." "And yet arranged with notable care," said Holmes. "Penbury is a man who has given thought to the impression his library conveys. The volumes on colonial administration occupy the second shelf, the works of political economy the third. He wishes to be understood as a man of serious practical intelligence. The novels are absent entirely." He turned from the shelves. "A man who permits no frivolity, even in his reading." This was my introduction to the particular quality of Holmes's attention during those first hours at Blackthorn House. He was not, in the conventional sense, investigating anything. No crime had been reported, no accusation made. We were guests, ostensibly in attendance upon a legal consultation that Penbury had not yet troubled to articulate with any precision. And yet Holmes moved through the morning with the quiet purposefulness of a naturalist in unfamiliar terrain, observing, noting, and filing away details that another man would not have perceived as details at all. Penbury joined us at breakfast at 9 o'clock, and it was here that Holmes conducted what I can only describe as an interview in the guise of a conversation. It was one of his gifts, perhaps the one I have found most difficult to characterize, that he could draw a man into the most revealing disclosures while appearing to do no more than make pleasant morning talk. He inquired after the history of the estate with apparent casualness, and within 20 minutes had induced Penbury to account, in broad and somewhat self-congratulatory terms, for the main movements of his commercial life. Import concerns in Liverpool during his younger years, investments in the Cape Colony during the 1880s, a period of activity in London financial circles that he described with a fluency suggesting long practice in its description. He had prospered, evidently and substantially. The source of that prosperity he left at every point agreeably vague. "A remarkable career," said Holmes pleasantly, refilling his cup. "You must have encountered considerable competition, particularly during the Cape period. Those were turbulent years for independent commercial men." Something moved behind Penbury's pale eyes, swiftly and then not, and he replied, with a smile precisely calibrated to deflect rather than dismiss, that turbulence was the natural condition of commerce, and that a man of resolution learned to find his footing wherever the ground was available to him. It was a polished answer, and Holmes received it with the appearance of complete satisfaction. Later, as we took the air upon the eastern terrace before the morning's business was properly begun, Holmes spoke with the compression of a man who has been thinking for some time and has reduced his conclusions to their essential terms. "He is not what he presents himself to be," said Holmes. his voice low and his gaze upon the middle distance of the park. The Liverpool period corresponds, in its broad dates, with a number of trading irregularities that came before the Board of Trade in 83 and 84, none of which resulted in prosecution, I should note, though several peripheral figures were considerably embarrassed. The Cape investments followed a pattern then common to men of speculative temperament and limited scruple. What Penbury has built is real enough. The house, the grounds, the charitable reputation, all genuine, but the foundation upon which it stands bears examination. You knew this before we arrived, I said. I suspected it. The handwriting confirmed a degree of it. A man who forms his letters with such studied control has generally spent years managing the gap between his private knowledge and his public account. The rest I have verified this morning. He glanced at me with a brief dry humour. I spent an instructive hour before you came down, Watson, with a collection of commercial directories and a volume of parliamentary reports, which I happened to have thought it prudent to bring from Baker Street. I ought not to have been surprised. I was not, in truth, entirely surprised. But I felt again the familiar slight vertigo of discovering how far ahead of me Holmes had been proceeding all along. The legal consultation, when it arrived at last after luncheon, proved to be a matter of some land boundary and a disputed right-of-way. Perfectly genuine in its particulars, Holmes assured me afterwards, and perfectly trivial. It had been, he said, a pretext. And the manner in which Penbury had conducted the meeting, careful, attentive, revealing nothing of greater weight than the documented boundary dispute required, confirmed that the genuine purpose of our invitation had not yet declared itself. What had declared itself over the course of that second day was the character of the undercurrent that ran beneath the surface of Blackthorn House. Hargreaves, the secretary, was a meticulous man of perhaps 40, whose professional manner was without fault, but whose eyes, when they rested upon his employer, held an expression that I gradually identified as something beyond deference, something that had the quality, I thought, of a man who possesses a private understanding he has made a deliberate choice not to use. Colonel Bryce had served with Penbury in some capacity, I gathered, during the African years, and there was between the two men a history whose weight was apparent in the slight stiffness of their exchanges, a stiffness too consistent and too carefully managed to be the mere residue of military formality. Young Mallory was solicitous to an extent that exceeded any connection of cousinship I could readily imagine, hovering at the periphery of conversations and volunteering assistance with the anxious frequency of a man who wishes to be considered indispensable. And then there was Miss Clara. She joined us that afternoon for a walk about the grounds at Penbury's suggestion, and proved to be a woman of composed intelligence whose conversation was both more direct and more carefully bounded than that of any other person in the house. She spoke of the estate with the familiarity of a long residence, of the village with genuine warmth, and of her uncle with a precision of expression, never unkind, never excessive, that struck me as the speech of a person who has trained herself over considerable time to say no more than she has decided to mean. Holmes walked beside her for some portion of the way and directed the conversation, with what appeared to be simple curiosity, toward the history of the household and the character of its domestic arrangements. She answered him with composure, and I observed that she never once glanced at him as she did so, keeping her eyes upon the path ahead with the fixed, even quality of a person who is attending very carefully to something other than what they appear to be attending to. That evening, as the four walls of my room closed about me once more, and the autumn dark pressed against the window glass, I lay with my hands behind my head and tried to order my impressions. Each of the four people with whom we shared that house owed something to Penbury. That much seemed plain enough. Each had a reason to be there. Each had, I was beginning to feel, a reason to remain that had less to do with affection or inclination than with necessity. Holmes had said that something held them there. I had agreed, the previous night, in the abstract. Now, lying in the stillness of Blackthorn House with the wind gone quiet and not a sound from anywhere in those orderly, watchful rooms, I began to feel it as a fact. Chapter 3. The Sudden Incident. The third day at Blackthorn House passed without event of any obvious significance, and it was precisely that absence of event which I found, in retrospect, most telling. There are silences in human affairs that are merely empty, and silences that are full to the point of pressure, and the silence of that Wednesday at Blackthorn was of the latter kind. Penbury was occupied with correspondence for most of the morning, receiving Hargreaves at regular intervals with the steady efficiency of a man conducting the affairs of a small principality. Colonel Bryce went out early on horseback, and returned in the early afternoon with the closed expression of a man who has settled something within himself one way or another. Mallory haunted the library and the billiard room in alternation, too restless for either, and Miss Clara walked in the kitchen garden alone for above an hour, pausing sometimes among the bare and ordered beds with the stillness of a person absorbed in thought rather than observation. Holmes spent the day in a manner that might to the uninstructed eye have appeared indolent. He read for a time, strolled about the grounds, exchanged a few words with each member of the household in the natural course of the day's movements, and retired briefly to our rooms on 2 occasions with no explanation offered. I had learned, over the many years of our association, that this apparent idleness was no such thing, and that the unhurried surface of Holmes in observation was precisely analogous to the calm of a river whose visible smoothness conceals a rapid and purposeful current below. I said nothing, kept my own counsel, and watched. At dinner that evening Penbury was, for the first time, something less than entirely composed. The alteration was slight, a fractional distraction behind the eyes, a pause before answering that was a moment longer than his usual practised promptness required, and I doubt that anyone at the table besides Holmes and myself remarked it. The conversation moved through its customary topics with the usual surface fluency, and if the laughter was a shade more effortful than it had been 2 evenings previous, there was nothing that could honestly be called an open sign of strain. After dinner, the company retired to the drawing-room, and it was there that Penbury made a remark which, though apparently casual, settled into my memory with the particular weight of things that prove, in time, to have mattered. He had been speaking of a legal matter, not the boundary question which had formed the ostensible reason for our visit, but something more general, and he said, without particular emphasis, that a man who put his affairs thoroughly in order was a man at peace with the unpredictability of circumstance. He looked at no one as he said it. The remark fell into a brief silence, and then the conversation moved elsewhere. I caught Holmes's eye across the room. His expression was entirely neutral. We separated for the night at 10:30. I read for perhaps half an hour, and had just extinguished my lamp when I became aware, with the sensitivity to the sounds of an unfamiliar house that a light sleeper inevitably develops, of a footstep in the corridor, careful, measured, going in the direction of the east wing. I thought little of it and drifted at length into sleep. It was Mrs. Petworth, the housekeeper, who raised the alarm. I heard her voice first, not a scream, which would have been more easily categorized and therefore less disturbing, but a single sharp exclamation of the kind that is drawn involuntarily from a composed person by a sight they have not prepared themselves for, and then the rapid knock at my door, and her voice outside it. Carefully controlled, but with an edge beneath the control that brought me upright and out of bed before she'd finished speaking. "Dr. Watson, sir, would you come at once, please? It is Mr. Penbury." I was in the corridor within a minute, my medical bag in hand from the force of long habit, and found her outside the door of the study at the end of the east passage, a room I had not previously entered, with the lamp she carried casting her face in sharp relief. She was a woman of 60, experienced and capable, and she held herself with admirable steadiness, but her face was white. "The door was locked, sir," she said. "I came to set the fire for the morning, and when he didn't answer, I tried the key from the linen press, which fits this lock as well, and found him so. I went in." Penbury sat at his desk in the attitude of a man who has leaned back in his chair to rest. Upright enough, his hands lying loosely before him among the papers, his head inclined very slightly forward. The lamp on the desk still burned with a low, steady flame. A glass of red wine stood at his right hand, near full. The papers before him were the kind of correspondence a man settles, in the evening hours, a letter in his own hand, half completed, and several documents folded and sealed. The fire had burned down to a grey residue of ash. The room was cold. I made my examination with the thoroughness that the occasion demanded, and the training of a medical man imposed, though it took me only a matter of minutes to establish what was abundantly apparent. Penbury had been dead for some hours. There was no mark of violence upon him. He used no sign of disturbance in his person or in the room about him. His expression, insofar as a dead man's features can be said to express anything, was not one of distress. I set my bag down and straightened, and it was only then that I noticed Holmes standing in the doorway. He had come silently, as was his habit, and stood now on the threshold without entering, his gaze moving across the room in that systematic, unhurried way that I had so often witnessed and never quite grown accustomed to. He looked at Penbury, at the desk, at the papers, at the wine-glass. He looked at the window, which was latched from within. He looked at the door, and at the lock, and at the key that Mrs. Petworth had used and that still projected from the keyhole on the inner side. Then he stood quite still for a moment, looking at nothing in particular, with the focused inwardness of a man who is not observing but thinking. "Heart failure," I said quietly. "At least that is the immediate appearance. There are no external signs of anything else. I shall want a proper examination in better light, but I see nothing here to contradict a natural cause." Holmes came into the room then, moving to the desk with a deliberateness that was not as I knew, the deliberateness of caution, but of method, of a man ensuring that each step is taken in the right order. He leaned forward over the papers without touching them, examining them at close range. He studied the wine-glass without handling it, bending until his face was very near the surface of the liquid. He straightened, moved to the window, examined the latch, the frame, the sill. He crouched for a moment beside the cold hearth. By this time Hargreaves had appeared and Mallory behind him, and presently Miss Clara, wrapped in a dark dressing gown and carrying her own candle, her face expressing the precise degree of shock that the occasion required, and I thought, not a fraction more. Colonel Bryce came last, filling the doorway with his broad frame, and took in the scene with the rapid, assessing look of a man accustomed to reading a field. The reactions were swift, cooperative, and collectively appropriate. Hargreaves offered at once to send for the village doctor and for the police. Mallory expressed his distress with the earnest excess of the genuinely shaken, or of a man who has decided to appear so. Bryce said very little, but his jaw was set with a rigidity that was not quite grief. Miss Clara stood near the doorway and did not look at her uncle. It fell to me, as the only medical man present, to take informal charge of the immediate arrangements. Holmes stepped back without ceremony and allowed this, moving to the corner of the room where he stood with his arms folded and his chin upon his chest, apparently disengaged from the practical business entirely. I knew better. I had seen him stand exactly so, in exactly that attitude of abstracted stillness, at the outset of 3 previous cases whose apparent simplicity had concealed, beneath the orderly surface of their circumstances, something altogether more deliberate and more dark. The locked door, the cold hearth, the carefully placed glass, the household assembled in its night-clothes with their faces composed and their eyes watchful, all of it arranged as a stage is arranged to produce a single, comfortable conclusion. Holmes did not believe in comfortable conclusions, and looking about me at the too still room and the too ready cooperation of its occupants, I found, to my unease, that neither, in that moment, did I. Chapter 4. Motives without malice. The village doctor arrived before 9 o'clock the following morning, a brisk, competent man named Somersby, who had evidently attended Penbury for some years, and who conducted his examination with the practised efficiency of a country physician long accustomed to being the first and sometimes the only medical authority for miles in any direction. I assisted him, and we spoke quietly together over the body in the cold study, while the household waited in the rooms below with the constrained patience of persons who have been asked not to go far. Doctor. Somersby's conclusion aligned with my own preliminary assessment. The heart, in his opinion, had simply failed. There were no marks, no contusions, no evidence of any external agency. Penbury had been a man of some stress and considerable private anxiety, he remarked. He had treated him for palpitations on 2 occasions in the past 18 months, and a sudden cardiac event in a man of his age and temperament was, from a clinical perspective, entirely unremarkable. He said this with the settled confidence of a man who has formed a view and sees no reason to question it, signed the certificate that was placed before him, and departed by 10:30. Holmes had been present throughout, standing near the window with his hands behind his back and saying nothing. When Somersby had gone, and I had closed my bag and washed my hands at the basin in the corner, Holmes spoke for the first time that morning with a directness that I recognised as the sign of a mind that has been moving rapidly since before dawn. "The certificate will serve," said he, "as it was intended to serve." I looked at him. "You're not satisfied." "I am very far from satisfied. but I shall say nothing of that to anyone in this house until I am rather more certain of my ground." He moved away from the window and sat in the chair beside the cold hearth. The chair, I noticed, that he had positioned the previous evening to afford the widest possible view of the room. "What I require from you this morning, Watson, is your recollection of the household's conduct at dinner last night. Not the words were entirely unremarkable, but the silences, who paused before speaking, and when and in whose presence. I gave him my impressions as accurately as I could, and he listened without interruption, his eyes upon the middle distance and his fingers laced together in his lap. When I had finished, he nodded once, as though a thing he had suspected had been confirmed to his satisfaction, and then rose and went to the door without further comment. I followed him downstairs. Inspector Crail of the County Constabulary arrived at 11, summoned by Hargreaves's message of the previous night. He was a conscientious man of the second order, thorough, methodical, and entirely prepared to accept the most straightforward interpretation of the facts before him. He moved through the house with his notebook open and his questions sensible and systematic, and the household answered him with a cooperation that was immediate, consistent, and, I noted with the alertness Holmes had long since instilled in me, remarkably uniform in its emphasis. Each person, questioned separately, stressed the same cluster of facts: Penbury's age, his history of cardiac symptoms, the locked door, the undisturbed room. The details were different, as one would expect from independent accounts, but the shape of each account was the same. It was in the course of the inspector's inquiries that the matter of the will emerged. Hargreaves mentioned it first, with the air of a man discharging an obligation he would rather not have. Penbury had revised his will some 3 weeks previously, he said, at the offices of Messrs. Callaway and Fitch in Oxford. The nature of the revision he did not know, having not been present at the consultation, though as secretary he had arranged the appointment. Crail noted this without visible excitement and moved to his next question, apparently satisfied that the circumstance was no more than the natural prudence of an elderly man settling his affairs. Holmes, who had accompanied the inspector with a quiet persistence that Crail accepted with the slightly baffled tolerance he had shown from the first, pursued the point in his own fashion that afternoon, when Messrs. Callaway and Fitch, contacted by telegram, confirmed that the revised will had indeed been executed, and that its principal departure from the previous instrument was the reduction of a number of specific bequests, to Miss Clara, to Colonel Bryce, thus and to one other party whose name they were not at present authorised to disclose, in favour of a charitable endowment bearing Penbury's name. I watched the faces of the household when this news was communicated, and found each one instructive in a different way. Hargreaves received it without visible reaction, which itself constituted a reaction, since a man who has served a wealthy employer for many years, and is told that the legacy he might reasonably have anticipated has been substantially reduced, might ordinarily be expected to show some flicker of feeling. Mallory pressed his lips together in a brief, involuntary movement, and then recovered himself with a smile that was a fraction too broad. Bryce said nothing, but the slight tightening about his eyes was the expression of a man who has received a blow he had partly anticipated. Miss Clara looked at her hands. Holmes and I walked that afternoon on the east terrace, the sky above us the flat pewter grey of an English autumn late in its season, and he spoke with the economy of a man who has more information than he is yet prepared to deploy. 3 of them stood to lose by the revision, I said. That is motive enough, taken alone. Motive enough, perhaps, for suspicion, Holmes replied. Not as yet for certainty. A revised will is a motive for resentment. Resentment and murder are not the same thing, and a court requires more than proximity and disadvantage. He turned up the collar of his coat against the cold. What troubles me is not the presence of motive, which is abundant, but its distribution. In the ordinary run of things, a single powerful motive attached to a single individual points tolerably clearly in a single direction. Here we have 3 persons with reason to wish the outcome reversed, each of them behaving with a composure that either indicates innocence or a very considerable self-command. The ambiguity is not accidental. You believe it was designed to be ambiguous? I believe, said he carefully, that if a crime has been committed here, it was committed by someone who understood that an apparent surfeit of motive can be as useful to the guilty party as an absence of it. When everyone has reason to have done a thing, no one is easily identified as the one who did it. He paused. And I saw in his face not the cold satisfaction of the analyst, but something more considered. Something that in another man I might have called unease. That argues for a degree of intelligence and premeditation that I find, I confess, rather more disquieting than the mere fact of the deed itself. We returned indoors as the light began to fail. The household gathered for a subdued and early dinner, at which conversation was reduced to its barest necessary minimum, the ordinary social lubricants having lost their power in the altered circumstances of the house. It was, I thought, the first evening since our arrival at which the performance had been allowed to lapse, and yet even that lapse had a quality of coordination about it, and as though the decision to be visibly subdued had been arrived at collectively and without explicit discussion. Afterwards I sat with Holmes in the small study that had been placed at our disposal, and raised the question that had been occupying me since the morning. If it was not heart failure, I said, then what was it? Summersby found nothing, and nor did I. Holmes was quiet for a moment. The fire crackled between us. From somewhere in the upper part of the house came the distant sound of a door closing, and then silence. That is precisely the right question, said Holmes at last, and the answer, when it comes, will depend not upon what was found, but upon what was not. He rose and moved to the small writing table in the corner of the room, where he sat with his pen and a sheet of paper and began, in his swift and characteristically compressed hand, to write. There are gaps in this case, Watson, deliberate gaps, constructed with care. I intend to find what fills them. I watched him write and said nothing further. The fire settled into its lower hour, and the house around us was perfectly deliberately still. Chapter 5. The Language of Conscience. There is a mode of inquiry that Holmes employs, which I have observed on sufficiently many occasions to recognise its outline without always being able to anticipate its direction, in which the questions asked bear so little apparent relationship to the answers sought, that the person under examination never perceives themselves to be under examination at all. It is not, strictly speaking, war deception. Holmes does not misrepresent his purpose or manufacture false pretences, but it proceeds from a conviction, which I have come to share through long experience, that a person questioned directly about their guilt or innocence will tell you only what they have prepared to say, whereas a person engaged in honest conversation about something else entirely will sometimes, without knowing it, tell you everything. He began with Hargreaves. The opportunity presented itself naturally enough. On the morning following Inspector Krale's departure, the inspector having satisfied himself that the circumstances warranted no further immediate action, and departed with the certificate and his notebook, and his comfortable conclusion, Hargreaves was occupied in the library, working through the considerable administrative apparatus that the death of a man of Penbury's affairs had set in motion. Holmes asked, with every appearance of idle curiosity, whether he might look over the estate records, citing some technical point in connection with the boundary question that was, of course, entirely manufactured. Hargreaves agreed with the ready helpfulness of a man who has decided that perfect cooperation is his surest ground, and the two of them worked in companionable proximity for the better part of an hour, Holmes with a ledger open before him and a look of mild professional interest, Hargreaves with his own papers, and the conversation moving between them at the irregular intervals of men sharing a room rather than conducting an interview. I was present, ostensibly reviewing some notes of my own, and I watched with the attention Holmes had trained in me across the years. What he drew from Hargreaves, in the end, was not any single revelation but a pattern, a series of small hesitations, each individually insignificant, that accumulated across the hour into something more telling. Hargreaves was meticulous, as we had established, and his meticulousness had a quality not merely of professional habit, but of emotional necessity, as though the maintenance of perfect order in the matters before him served as a bulwark against some disorder he did not allow himself to contemplate. When Holmes introduced in passing the subject of Penbury's African years, and Hargreaves's pen moved with a fractionally increased precision across the page, the response not of a man who has nothing to conceal, but of a man who has long practised concealing it. Holmes did not press. He made a note of his own in the margin of the ledger, thanked Hargreaves pleasantly, and we withdrew. "He knows," said Holmes once we were in the corridor, his voice barely above a murmur. "Not everything, perhaps, but enough. He has known for some years, and the knowledge has cost him." "Enough to have acted upon it?" "Enough to have considered it," said Holmes, which was not quite the same answer. He found Colonel Bryce that afternoon in the billiard-room, knocking balls about the table with the mechanical repetitiveness of a man who is not playing but occupying his hands while his mind is elsewhere. Holmes accepted the offer of a cue with every appearance of pleasure, and they played for a time in the easy, slightly competitive manner of two men of roughly equivalent capability. Bryce was a capable player, direct and unornamental as might be expected, and the conversation that accompanied the game was of the kind that flows naturally between men engaged in a shared physical occupation, requiring no social effort and offering no obvious opportunities for guardedness. Holmes moved from sport to soldiering with the unhurried ease of a conversationalist who has all the time in the world, and thence, by a route I could not quite follow in its individual steps, to the question of what a man owes to a former comrade when the comrade's conduct has been, in some respects, less than honourable. It was put in general terms, with a philosophical air, as though the question were merely abstract. Bryce considered it with the gravity of a man for whom it was not abstract at all, and said, with a deliberateness that indicated he was choosing every word, that a soldier's first obligation was to the truth of what he had witnessed, and his second to the protection of those who could not protect themselves, and that the balance between these two things was not always simple to strike. No, Holmes agreed pleasantly, chalking his cue, it very seldom is. He said nothing more on the subject. Bryce returned to his mechanical play, and the conversation moved elsewhere, and we parted on excellent terms. But I had seen in the Colonel's face during that one exchange, and something that confirmed what Holmes had already surmised, a man carrying a specific and long-endured weight, the weight not of guilt, but of knowledge, and of the choices that knowledge compels. With Mallory, Holmes took a quite different approach. The young man was, by the following morning, in a state of agitation insufficiently concealed by his customary display of practical helpfulness, and Holmes met this state not with the subtle indirection he had employed with the others, but with a kind of direct warm attention that I can only describe as deliberately disarming. He sat with Mallory in the morning room after breakfast and talked to him, not interrogated, not probed, but simply talked, with the frank interest of a man who finds his companion genuinely engaging. And the effect upon Mallory was precisely what Holmes had calculated. He expanded, relaxed, became by degrees the person he might have been in circumstances of less strain, and in that expansion revealed, without any particular dramatic moment of disclosure, that his connection to Penbury was financial in a manner that went considerably beyond cousinship, that he had borrowed substantially and repeatedly, and that the revision of the will had implications for him that he was only beginning to understand. None of this was offered as confession. It came as the natural overflow of a man whose reservoir of anxiety had been filled beyond its capacity, and who found, in Holmes's attentive and apparently uncritical presence, something that resembled relief. Holmes expressed neither judgment nor sympathy, merely listened, and Mallory, finding himself neither condemned nor particularly comforted, subsided into a thoughtful quiet that struck me as more honest than anything he had previously displayed. Miss Clara was last, and the most difficult. She was in the garden again, in the late afternoon of that same day, and Holmes joined her there with a directness that was, I think, a deliberate departure from the methods he had used with the others. He did not contrive an approach. He simply walked out to where she stood among the dormant beds and fell into step beside her, and after a few minutes of the quiet that she seemed to find more natural than conversation, he said, without preface, that he found the garden remarkably well ordered for the time of year. She replied that order in a garden required constant effort, and that the moment one stopped attending to it, the whole gave way to what lay beneath. That is true of a great many things, said Holmes. She glanced at him then, the first time I noted that she had looked at him directly in any exchange I'd witnessed, and the look contained something that I had not expected and found difficult to name. It was not wariness exactly, nor defiance, nor the particular anxiety of the guilty. It was more nearly the expression of a person who has been carrying something alone for a very long time, and who perceives in the person beside them, for the first time, the possibility that the weight might be shared. She said nothing further. Holmes did not press her. They completed the circuit of the garden in silence and parted at the terrace steps with a simple civility. But as we went indoors, Holmes paused for a moment at the door with his hand on the frame, and I saw in his face, briefly, and then replaced by the habitual gravity of his working expression, something that might in another man have been called sorrow. That evening, when we had drawn our chairs to the fire in the small study and the house around us had settled into its nightly composure, I asked him what he had concluded from the day's observations. He was quiet for a time, the firelight moving across his angular face, his long fingers turning his pipe without filling it, a habit of his when thinking outstripped the desire for tobacco. "I have concluded," said he at last, "that each of them is afraid, not of the same thing and not in the same degree, but each of them carries a fear that is particular and old, and that Penbury, in his lifetime, he made deliberate use of." He set the pipe down on the table beside him. "A man who holds 4 people in fear, Watson, does not do so by accident. He does so by method, and a method implies knowledge, documented, preserved, capable of surviving its owner." He looked at me steadily. "That knowledge is somewhere in this house, and whoever killed Penbury, if indeed someone killed him, knows it." I sat with that thought in the quiet of the room, while the fire burned low between us, and found it gave me no comfort at all. Chapter 6. Fear Beneath Composure. It rained heavily that night, and the sound of it against the window glass of my room was for once conducive to sleep rather than otherwise. I woke late to a morning of pewter cloud and dripping eaves, and came downstairs to find Holmes already absent from the breakfast table, his cup barely touched and his toast untouched entirely, which told me, as surely as a note would have done, that he had been up since early and was engaged on something that had displaced, for the time being, all bodily requirements. I breakfasted alone, exchanged a few quiet words with Mrs. Petworth about the arrangements for the day, and was finishing my second cup when Holmes reappeared at the door of the dining room with the particular quality of alertness in his bearing that I associated not with the beginning of inquiry but with its acceleration, the look of a man who has found the seam he was searching for and is following it downward. He sat opposite me, poured a cup of tea that he did not drink, and spoke without preliminary. "The study," said he. "Penbury kept a locked drawer in the lower left section of his desk. The lock is of a simple pattern, and it has been opened recently, within the last several days, I should judge, by someone using an implement rather than the proper key, which was on his person when he died. The scratches about the keyhole are fresh. The drawer itself is empty." I set down my cup. "Someone searched it. Someone emptied it. There is a distinction. Searching implies uncertainty about the contents. Emptying implies knowledge of them." He folded his hands on the table before him. "Whatever Penbury kept in that drawer, and I think we may form a tolerably confident opinion as to its general character, it is no longer there." I asked him when he thought the drawer had been accessed. "The scratches are not obscured by any accumulation of dust, however fine, and this house, as we have established, is kept with exemplary thoroughness. They were not there a week ago, or Mrs. Petworth's cloth would have caught the metal filings and swept them away. They are there now. The window of opportunity is there for the period since Penbury's death, during which the study has been technically undisturbed but in practice accessible to anyone in the household who chose to enter it quietly." He paused. "I ought to have examined that drawer on the first night. I did not, and that omission was an error I do not intend to repeat." It was rare for Holmes to acknowledge a tactical mistake, and the frankness of it told me something about the seriousness with which he was now treating the case. We spent the morning hours in a methodical review of what Holmes had by this time assembled regarding Penbury's history, and the fuller picture that emerged from its arrangement was, I confess, a good deal darker than the one I had formed from our earlier conversations. The Liverpool period, which Holmes had touched on briefly at the outset, had involved, it now appeared, the active suppression of a fraud claim brought by a group of small investors who had put their savings into a shipping concern that Penbury had promoted with considerable enthusiasm and rather less honesty. The matter had been resolved out of court, with payments made under conditions of strict confidentiality, and one of the men who had negotiated the settlement on the investors' behalf had been, at that time, a junior solicitor named Hargreaves. I stared at Holmes when he told me this. "The same Hargreaves," he confirmed, with the equanimity of a man who has long since absorbed his surprise and moved past it. He was not then in Penbury's employ, of course. He was for a brief period effectively his adversary. How that adversarial relationship was converted into the present one of a loyal service is a question to which I do not yet have a definitive answer, but the general outlines are not difficult to imagine. The African period yielded still more. The colonial investments Holmes had alluded to previously had included, it emerged, a transaction of the sort that casts a permanent shadow, the acquisition of mining rights over land whose title was disputed accomplished through the intermediary of a local official who had subsequently died in circumstances that were recorded as accidental, but which Holmes, having reviewed the relevant consular correspondence, described as at minimum convenient. The officer who had investigated the death and filed the report had been, at that time, a Captain Bryce of the 3rd Hussars. I was quiet for a moment. "He's had them all," I said. "He has," said Holmes, "each one bound to him by a specific knowledge that he could deploy at will. Hargreaves by his involvement, however tangential, in the Liverpool settlement. Bryce by the report he filed and what it did not say. Mallory by the debts, which are of a scale that would ruin him entirely if called in, and which were, I think, extended deliberately for precisely that purpose, rather than from any impulse of generosity." He rose and went to the window, looking out at the rain-sodden park with his hands clasped behind him. Penbury was not merely a man of questionable past. He was a man who curated his leverage over others as a deliberate instrument of power, and who maintained it with the patience and the application that another man might have brought to scholarship or to art. "And Miss Clara?" I asked. "What does he hold over her?" Holmes turned from the window. The expression on his face was one I had seen seldom, and which I knew to indicate not professional uncertainty, but a more personal reluctance, the reluctance of a man confronting a circumstance that his analytical faculties can illuminate, but that his other qualities regard with a different and less comfortable light. "Miss Clara," said he carefully, "is the niece of a man whose estate she has managed in practical terms for the past 4 years, during a period in which her uncle's health and temperament rendered him increasingly unfit to manage it himself. She did so without formal authority, without compensation, and without acknowledgement. She did so because she had no alternative, for reasons that relate to her own circumstances before she came to Blackthorn House, circumstances which Penbury knew, and which he used, I am quite certain, to ensure her continued presence and her continued silence. He did not elaborate further, and I did not press him. There was a quality to his restraint on the subject of Miss Clara that I had come to recognise as something more than professional discretion, and I respected it accordingly. The afternoon brought an unexpected development. I was crossing the hall at about 3:30 when I encountered Bryce emerging from the corridor that led to the east wing, and therefore to the study, with a directness of pace that altered fractionally upon seeing me, becoming at once slightly more deliberate and slightly more casual in a way that was not quite natural. He greeted me with the brevity of a man who has somewhere to be, and does not wish to discuss where that has been, and continued towards the stairs. I watched him go and then went to find Holmes. Holmes listened to my account without visible reaction, and then was silent for several seconds. "He is looking for what was in the drawer," said he at last, "which means either that he did not take it, or that he took only a portion of it and now fears what the remainder may contain. Which do you think more likely?" "I think," said Holmes, "that more than one person may have had access to that drawer in the hours following Penbury's death, and that what I took for a single act of removal may in fact represent a sequence of them." He picked up his pipe and this time filled it, which told me that he had moved from active inquiry into the reflective phase that sometimes preceded his most significant advances. The question of who took what, and when, and with what knowledge of what others had already taken, is one that will require a degree of patience to resolve, but it is not unresolvable. By evening the rain had eased to a fine persistent mist, and the house had settled into a quiet that was different in quality from the composed stillness of previous days. There was an edge to it now, something taut and fragile, like the surface of water at the precise moment before it breaks. At dinner the conversation was reduced to the merely functional, and Miss Clara did not appear at all, sending a message by Mrs. Petworth that she had a headache and would take a tray in her room. Holmes watched the empty chair at the table with the level attention of a man reading a document, and said nothing, and ate his dinner with the unhurried deliberateness of one who knows that the matter is approaching its crisis, and intends to be entirely ready when it does. Chapter 7. The Convenient Conclusion. There is a particular temptation in the investigation of any suspicious death, which I have observed to operate with equal force upon the trained medical man and the conscientious detective, and which consists in the desire, honest, humane, and in many cases entirely reasonable, to accept the simplest explanation that the facts will support. Death by natural causes requires no villain, no victim in the fullest sense, no reckoning. It asks nothing further of the living except that they grieve in their own fashion and proceed. And when the evidence is genuinely ambiguous, the pull of that simplicity can be very strong indeed. I felt it myself, on the morning of the 5th day at Blackthorn House, with a force that I think honest to acknowledge. Dr. Summersby had certified the death. Inspector Crail had closed his inquiry without finding cause to pursue the matter further. Penbury had a documented history of cardiac trouble, had lived under considerable private strain, and had died in a locked room with no sign of disturbance, in the posture of a man who had simply stopped. Every fact I had personally observed was consistent with that conclusion, and Holmes had found, it was true, a forced drawer and a set of scratches about a keyhole, but a forced drawer proved only that someone had rifled a dead man's papers, which was a moral failing rather than a legal one, and suggested guilt of concealment rather than of murder. I did not voice these thoughts to Holmes. I mention them only because I believe they illuminate the genuine difficulty of the case, and because, in setting them down, I'm reminded of how completely and carefully the whole affair had been arranged to produce exactly the train of reasoning I have just described. The household, meanwhile, was visibly relaxing. It was Mallory who provided the most transparent illustration of this shift. He appeared at breakfast on that 5th morning with something approaching his natural manner restored, the heartiness less forced, the anxiety less immediately present behind the eyes, and spoke of returning to London within the week, of practical matters to be attended to, of the obligations of ordinary life resuming their claim. There was in this not callousness exactly, but the relief of a man who has stood at the edge of a precipice and now finds himself several steps back from it, on solid ground. He was not, I thought, a man who had done murder. He was, however, a man who had done something, and whose chief emotion at the apparent closure of the case was the relief of the reprieved. Hargreaves was more contained in his adjustment, but equally discernible. He had by that morning resumed full command of the administrative machinery that Penbury's death had temporarily disrupted, and moved through the day with the precision of a man who has found, in the resumption of familiar duties, a reliable method of not thinking about whatever it is that he does not wish to think about. He spoke to Holmes once, briefly, about the formal arrangements for the estate during the period before the will was proved, and the exchange was entirely practical and entirely correct, and Hargreaves's composure during it was of a kind that I had come to recognise as the composure of settled resolution rather than of mere temperament. Colonel Bryce was less easy to read. He remained quieter than the others, and showed no particular signs of the relief that Mallory exhibited, which might argue either for a conscience more heavily burdened, or for the stoicism of a military man who does not permit himself the luxury of visible relaxation until he is well clear of the field. He spent most of the morning alone in the billiard-room, not playing but sitting in the chair by the window, with a glass of brandy and the look of a man engaged in a private accounting of some length and complexity. When Holmes looked in briefly and offered a word of greeting, Bryce returned it with a nod that was civil enough but contained no invitation to remain. Miss Clara was the most difficult to assess, as she had been throughout. She had reappeared at breakfast after the previous evening's absence, pale and composed and entirely self-possessed, and she moved through the morning's arrangements, the household still requiring direction, the practical consequences of Penbury's death still generating their steady administrative demands, with the quiet competence that I had by now come to understand as the expression of a character formed by years of necessity rather than inclination. If she felt relief, she did not show it. If she felt anything at all beyond the controlled attentiveness she brought to every task, she had long since perfected the art of keeping it entirely to herself. Holmes had been absent for much of the morning, and when he returned at midday his manner carried that quality of a particular kind of stillness, not repose but concentration gathered to a point, that told me he had been working, and that what he had found had given him cause for the most careful thought. At luncheon he was easy and conversational, in a way that, under the circumstances, I found somewhat unexpected, drawing Mallory into an agreeable discussion of London theatres and engaging Hargreaves on the subject of estate law, with every appearance of purely academic interest. Miss Clara, who had not been drawn into the conversation of the previous days by any approach of Holmes's, yet looked at him once during the meal with an expression that I can only describe as watchful, the expression of a person who has recognised a pattern and is waiting to see where it leads. It was in the early afternoon, when the household had dispersed to its several occupations and Holmes and I had retired once more to the small study, that he said what he had been, I sensed, composing since morning. "The narrative has formed," said he, settling into his chair and crossing his long legs before him. "You can feel it, can you not? The shape of an acceptable account is consolidating around the facts, being tested for internal consistency, being quietly agreed upon. Penbury was an old man of uncertain health who had recently undergone the stress of revising his will and contemplating the diminishment of those about him. He drank a glass of wine, sat down at his desk to complete his evening correspondence, and his heart gave way. Nothing more, a sad but unremarkable end." "And you do not believe it?" I said. "I did not say so," he replied, with a precision that I recognized. "I said the narrative has formed. A narrative's formation tells us something in itself. It tells us that someone, or more than one person, has an interest in its acceptance. The question is whether its acceptance is warranted by the evidence or merely convenient." He was silent for a moment, and I had the impression of a man who has arrived at a fork in his own reasoning and is examining each branch before committing to either. "There is a further point," said he. "I wrote to a colleague at St. Bartholomew's 3 days ago, a man of exceptional competence in the area of toxicological analysis, and his reply arrived this morning." He reached into the inside breast pocket of his coat and produced a folded letter, which he held without opening. "He confirms that there exist several compounds of organic origin which, administered in a dose calibrated to the physical condition of the recipient, would produce symptoms at death indistinguishable from cardiac failure under routine post-mortem examination. Compounds derived from plant sources, Watson, available to a person of botanical knowledge and patient application, leaving no trace that a country physician conducting a standard examination would have cause to seek." The room was very quiet. Outside the window the mist had returned, and blurring the lines of the garden and the park beyond it into a uniform soft grey. "Summersby would not have found it," I said. "Summersby was not looking for it," said Holmes. "Which is, I suspect, exactly what was relied upon." He folded the letter and returned it to his pocket. "A natural death in a locked room is investigated as a natural death. A suspicious death in a locked room is investigated as a suspicious death. The entire architecture of this affair was designed to ensure that no one with the means and authority to investigate further would have any reason to do so." He rose from his chair and stood for a moment at the window, looking into the grey afternoon with the focused remoteness that meant his mind was no longer in the room with me, but somewhere further along the chain of reasoning he was following. "The case is not closed," said he quietly, as though reminding himself rather than informing me. "It has merely been made to look as though it is, and there is a considerable difference between a thing that is finished and a thing that has been arranged to appear so." I sat with that distinction for the remainder of the afternoon, while the mist deepened over the park and the house around us settled, with its customary seamless efficiency, into the quiet rhythms of an early winter evening, and I thought of the empty drawer and the scratched lock and the wine-glass, and Miss Clara's eyes upon Holmes across the luncheon table, watchful and waiting. And I thought that whatever the case had appeared to be that morning, it was not and had never been finished. Chapter 8. The Overlooked Detail. Holmes had always maintained, and I had heard him say it in one formulation or another across the full span of our acquaintance, that the decisive element in any investigation is not the fact that announces itself, but the fact that hides, the detail so minor in appearance, so thoroughly embedded in the ordinary texture of its surroundings, that the observer passes it not once but repeatedly without registering its significance. It is not, he would insist, a matter of acuity alone. A man may have excellent eyes and a well-ordered mind and still overlook the thing that matters because he is looking for the wrong category of thing entirely. The secret is not to look harder, but to look differently, to interrogate the arrangement of the ordinary rather than scanning for the extraordinary that has been placed among it. I had understood this principle in the abstract for many years. I understood it rather more concretely on the morning of the 6th day, when Holmes asked me to accompany him back to the study. The room had been left largely undisturbed since the night of Penbury's death, Inspector Crail having seen no reason to impose any formal restriction, and its undisturbedness had, in a house of this household's careful habits, a quality almost of deliberateness, as though the room had been preserved not by official instruction, but by the tacit agreement of persons who did not care to be seen entering it. The fire had not been relaid. The papers on the desk had not been touched, at least not visibly. The wine-glass stood where it had stood on that first night, its level unchanged. The deep red of the wine slightly thickened at the rim where the air had worked upon it over the intervening days. Holmes closed the door behind us and stood for a moment in the centre of the room, in the attitude of a man revisiting a space with entirely fresh eyes, turning his gaze slowly and systematically about him, as though he were seeing it for the first time. I had learned not to speak during this preliminary phase, and I held my silence, watching him. He moved first to the desk and examined the papers without touching them, bending low in the way I had observed on the night itself. Then he straightened and stood with his hands behind his back and looked at the desk's surface as a whole, in the way that a surveyor looks at a landscape rather than at its individual components. Then he turned his attention to the wine-glass. He studied it for what seemed, in the silence of that cold room, an unusually long time. He bent until his eyes were level with the surface of the liquid. He moved around the desk to examine the glass from the opposite side. He straightened again and looked at the desk, at the glass, at the position of the papers, at the lamp, at the chair in which Penbury had been found. And then he was still, in the particular way that meant something had occurred to him that required a moment's complete interior attention before it could be spoken. "Watson," said he, "you attended Penbury in the years before your practice in London. Left or right-handed?" I had not, in fact, attended Penbury at any time, our acquaintance being entirely of recent date, and I said so. "No matter," said Holmes, with a slight distraction in his voice that indicated he had already moved past the question's dependence on my answer. "Mrs. Petworth will know. She has managed this household for 11 years. He turned to look at me directly. "In the meantime, consider the desk as it stands before you. The lamp is positioned to the left of the central working area, casting its light across the surface from that direction. The inkstand is to the left. The blotter, in its wear, shows greater compression on the left side, as a man's writing hand will press more consistently upon the near edge of the blotter as he works. The completed letters, sealed and stacked, are to the left, placed there for easy access by a left hand when picking up the pen or setting down the finished document. I looked at the desk and saw that he was correct in each particular. Penbury was left-handed, I said. Emphatically so. It is written in the arrangement of every object he habitually used in this room. A man's desk is, in that respect, as reliable a record of his physical habits as his own handwriting." Holmes turned back to the wine-glass, and the wine-glass is at his right hand. I looked at it. It stood at the right side of the desk, closer to the right-hand edge, in the position where a right-handed man would naturally have placed it, close to the dominant hand, within easy reach of a habitual gesture. "A left-handed man," I said slowly, "would keep his glass at his left." "He would," said Holmes, by reflex if nothing else. "Consider how a man reaches for a glass when drinking in the course of work. He does not think about it, he reaches, and the dominant hand is the hand that reaches. A left-handed man, at his own desk, in his own study, engaged in his own correspondence at the end of his own evening, would no more place his wine-glass at his right hand than he would write with it." He paused. "Unless he placed it there deliberately, which serves no purpose I can conceive of, or unless someone else placed it there after the fact, who did not know or did not think about which hand Penbury favoured." The room seemed to contract slightly as he said it, or perhaps it was only my own attention narrowing to the small still object on the desk and the enormous implication it carried in its misplacement. I visited Mrs. Petworth in the housekeeper's room within the quarter hour, on the pretext of inquiring about some domestic arrangements, and managed, in the natural course of conversation, to raise the question of Penbury's habits at his desk. She confirmed it without hesitation or surprise. Mr. Penbury had been left-handed since boyhood, she said, and she had been setting his desk in the particular configuration she knew since the first month of her tenure. The glass always to the left, beside the lamp. Holmes received her confirmation with a nod that acknowledged it as a formality. He had, I suspected, already treated the matter as settled, and turned his attention to what followed from it. "The glass was moved," said he when we were back in our study, "after death, by someone who entered the locked room, altered the arrangement of its contents to reinforce the appearance of natural, undisturbed circumstances, and left again, locking the door behind them. But the door was locked when Mrs. Petworth found it," I said, "with the key on the inside." "Yes." Holmes picked up his pipe from the table beside his chair, turned it in his fingers and set it down again. "That particular point I have been considering for some days, and I believe I understand it. though I shall want to confirm one or two further details before I'm prepared to state it with full confidence." He looked at me steadily. "There is a method, Watson, which requires only that the inner key be not fully engaged in the lock, turned sufficiently to block casual entry, but not driven home to the full extent of the mechanism. Under those conditions, a thin implement passed beneath the door can be used to turn the key from without, and the door will lock in the conventional manner upon the instrument's removal. It is not a common knowledge, but it is not an uncommon method among those who have had occasion to research it." "Someone researched it," I said. "Someone prepared for it," Holmes replied, which was the more significant observation. "This was not improvisation. The misplaced glass tells us that the scene was dressed, but dressing a scene is a thing one does when one has anticipated the need to do it. Whoever entered that room did so with a purpose already formed and a method already chosen." He was quiet for a moment. "That is the measure of what we are dealing with, Watson. Not a sudden crime of passion, not even the opportunistic act of a person confronted unexpectedly, with a means and a motive at the same moment. This was planned, calmly, carefully, and well in advance." I sat with that assessment in the cold, quiet room and felt its full weight. There is something that the mind resists. Even the mind of a man accustomed as mine had become to the proximity of human darkness, in the contemplation of a murder that was not the product of heat or desperation, but of cold and patient thought. It places a different and more disquieting kind of intelligence at the centre of the thing. It suggests, in a way that crimes of passion do not, that the person responsible had lived with the intention for some period of time, carrying it privately through the ordinary days of an ordinary life, until the moment they had selected to act upon it arrived. Holmes rose from his chair and went again to the window, standing with his back to me and looking into the grey park with the steadiness of a man who has arrived at a conclusion he does not entirely wish to have reached. "Tonight," said he, "I shall want to speak to Miss Clara." Chapter 9. The Truth Revealed. The evening came in quietly, without drama, the way evenings do in the English countryside in late autumn. The light simply draining from the sky over a period of half an hour until the windows held only the reflection of the lamps within, and the world outside ceased to exist in any practical sense. Mrs. Petworth had set the fires in the principal rooms, and the household had gathered and dispersed in its customary pattern, and by 9 o'clock the corridors were still, and the only sounds were the occasional settling of the house itself, the intimate domestic sounds of old timber and old stone adjusting to the cold. Holmes had asked me, before dinner, to arrange that Miss Clara would be available to speak with us in the small sitting-room at 9:30, and had asked me further to ensure in whatever manner seemed natural that the other members of the household were settled in their own quarters for the evening. I accomplished the first by a word with Miss Clara herself, who received the request with the stillness of a person who has been expecting it, and the second by the simple expedient of an early and rather dull conversation about tomorrow's domestic arrangements, that sent both Mallory and Hargreaves to their rooms before 9, and by conveying to Colonel Bryce, with the confidential manner of a fellow military man, that Holmes was of the opinion that the evening's conversation would be of a technical, medical, and legal nature, unlikely to be of interest to him. Bryce accepted this with the directness of a man who recognises a diplomatic withdrawal when one is offered, and wished us a civil good night. Miss Clara was already in the sitting-room when we arrived, seated in the chair nearest the fire with her hands in her lap and her back straight in the manner of a woman who is determined to meet what is coming without the comfort of any protective posture. She wore a dark dress and no jewellery, and her face in the firelight had the composed quality I had observed throughout our stay, though the composure was, I thought, of a different texture now, less the smoothness of a surface maintained by habitual will than the stillness of a person who has set something down and is waiting, with a kind of exhausted relief, to be relieved of it entirely. Holmes took the chair opposite her. I sat to one side near the window and opened my notebook in the way of a man recording proceedings, though what I wrote in it that evening was a great deal less than what I observed. Holmes did not begin with accusation, nor with the display of assembled evidence that I had sometimes seen him employ to dramatic effect in other circumstances. He began, characteristically, with a question that appeared to have nothing to do with the matter at hand. "Your uncle kept a garden journal," said he. "I noticed the shelf of them in the study. 11 volumes, one for each year he occupied this house. The current volume was not among them." Miss Clara looked at him for a moment. "No," she said. It was not. You took it. I did, because it contained records of the plants he grew in the kitchen garden, including those he cultivated in the glass house at the eastern end, which is kept locked and which you manage. A brief pause. Yes. Holmes was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had the quality not of a man pressing for advantage, but of one who is tracing a line he has already drawn, verifying each point as he reaches it. Aconitine, said he, derived from monkshood, which grows readily in English gardens, and which your uncle cultivated, among other specimens, in that glass house. In its purified and concentrated form, administered in a sufficiently precise dose, it produces cardiac arrest. The symptoms are those of natural heart failure. A country physician conducting a standard examination has no cause to look for it, and no means of detecting it by ordinary observation. Miss Clara did not answer. Her hands in her lap were perfectly still. The wine, I said, understanding arriving with the completeness of a thing long prepared. It was in the wine. The glass was placed at the wrong hand, said Holmes, by someone who knew the study well enough to enter it quietly and to arrange its surfaces convincingly, but who had not observed, or had forgotten in the press of the moment, which hand Penbury habitually favoured. A small error. In a case constructed with such thoroughness, it is the kind of small error that only arises when the person making it has been carrying the weight of the plan for a very long time and is, at the moment of its execution, operating under a degree of strain that precision cannot entirely survive. He looked at Miss Clara steadily, and she looked back at him with the same directness, and there was between them, in that moment, a quality of mutual recognition that I found difficult to characterize. Two people of considerable intelligence, acknowledging each other across an unbridgeable distance. The locked door, Holmes continued, his voice level and unhurried. You placed the wine on the desk while Penbury was still living. In the evening, before dinner, when you brought him the evening tray as you habitually did. The compound was already introduced into the glass, or into the decanter from which you poured it in his presence, which would have appeared entirely natural. You left him to his correspondence. The effect would have been gradual, not immediate, allowing you to be elsewhere in the house, visibly during the critical period. When you returned later, finding him as you expected to find him, you entered with your own key. You managed the household. And the linen press key, as Mrs. Petworth later demonstrated, fits the study lock. Moved the glass to what you supposed was the appropriate position, withdrew the documents from the locked drawer, and locked the door again from the outside by means of the implement you had prepared. Miss Clara said nothing. The fire between them spoke more than she did, settling with small sounds into its lower hour. The documents from the drawer, Holmes said, you destroyed them. I burned them, she said. It was the first thing she had offered voluntarily, and the steadiness of her voice did not waver. That night, in my room. They contained records of the arrangements he had made, his instruments of control over the people in this house. Over all of us, she said. And then, after a silence of some length, you should know, Mr. Holmes, that what he held over the others, over Hargreaves and the Colonel and Edward, was no more than the ordinary material of weak men in difficult situations, mistakes, failures of courage or of judgment. The kind of thing that a decent world would not punish beyond the moment of its commission. Her eyes did not leave his face. What he held over me was of a different kind. I will not describe it to you. I will say only that it was the sort of knowledge that a man of genuine honour would have destroyed rather than preserved, and that Penbury had preserved it for 14 years and made use of it for 9. Holmes was quiet. The fire crackled once and was still. He knew you would not go to the law, said Holmes at last. He knew I could not, and he knew I knew it. She looked down at her hands for the first time in the conversation, and then up again with the resolution of a person completing something they have decided to see through. I am not asking for your sympathy, Mr. Holmes. I am not, I think, a person who has ever placed much faith in sympathy as a practical resource. I did what I did with clear understanding of what it was, and I am prepared to answer for it. And the others? I asked. Did they know? They suspected, she said, in the way that people suspect things they have decided not to examine. No one asked me anything. No one offered anything. We are all, in our different fashions, skilled at the management of what we prefer not to know. Holmes rose from his chair and stood for a moment at the mantelpiece, his hand resting upon it and his face turned partially away from us both, and I was struck, as I had occasionally been struck before in the long history of our work together, by the curious and particular loneliness of his position, the man who sees everything and must consequently bear everything that seeing entails. "I am obliged to act upon what I know," said he finally, and the formality of the phrasing was itself, I thought, a kind of acknowledgment of the distance between what the law required and what another set of considerations might have counselled. Inspector Crail must be notified. There must be a proper examination of the body and a proper inquiry. What follows from that inquiry is beyond my authority to determine. Miss Clara nodded, as though she had anticipated this conclusion and had made her own peace with it at some earlier and quieter moment. "I know," said she, "I have known, since you arrived, that this was how it would end. I did not attempt to prevent it." A pause. "I should like, if it is possible, until the morning." Holmes looked at her for a long moment. "You have until morning," said he. He left the room first, and I followed, and the door closed softly behind us on Miss Clara and the diminishing fire, and the silence of Blackthorn House closed over everything like water over a stone. Chapter 10. Justice and Reflection. I did not sleep at all that night. I lay in the familiar dark of my room at Blackthorn House, and listened to the silence of it, which was different now from every other silence I had heard within those walls, emptied, at last, of its long tension, as a room is emptied when the thing it has been holding is finally named. I thought of Miss Clara in her room at the end of the corridor, and wondered whether she slept, and suspected that she did not, and felt the particular helplessness of a man who has been, by the nature of his circumstances, the instrument of another person's undoing, however justified that undoing may have been by every principle of law and reason that he can bring to bear upon it. Holmes was up before dawn. I heard him moving in the corridor, and his step had the quiet, deliberate quality it takes when he is carrying something inwardly that he will not yet commit to words. I dressed and found him in the small study, standing at the window in the first grey light, with a cup of cold tea at his elbow, that he had evidently made and forgotten entirely. He did not turn when I entered. "She is still here," said he. It was not a question. "I heard nothing in the night," I said. "No carriage, yet no movement on the drive." He nodded once. I understood that he had, during the hours of darkness, considered the possibility that she might choose otherwise, flight or something worse, and that the confirmation of her continued presence was not merely a practical relief, but something that he had allowed himself very quietly to hope for. Inspector Crail arrived at 10:30, summoned by the telegram Holmes had sent the previous evening from the village post office. He came with a constable and the businesslike manner of a man who has been told, in the careful language that Holmes employs when he wishes to be precise without being premature, that new information has come to light regarding the death of Mr. Alistair Penbury, and that the matter warrants his personal attention. Holmes met him in the hall and spoke with him privately for 20 minutes, and when they emerged, Crail's expression had the quality of a man revising a conclusion he had been rather pleased with, which is never an entirely comfortable process. The examination that followed, of the study, of the wine-glass, which Holmes had ensured remained untouched, and of certain botanical materials in the locked glass house to which Miss Clara herself provided the key, occupied the better part of the morning. A specialist was telegraphed for from Oxford. Holmes directed each stage with the patient thoroughness of a man who knows that a case constructed on fine detail must be confirmed with equal fineness, and who will not trust the confirmation to anyone else's eye. Miss Clara was interviewed by Inspector Crail at midday in the drawing-room, Haas with Holmes and myself present at her request. She answered every question with the same composed directness she had shown the previous evening. No evasions, no amendments to the account she had given Holmes, no attempt to redistribute blame or to soften the plain shape of what she had done. She confirmed the method, confirmed the timing, confirmed the destruction of the documents. When asked whether she wished to have a solicitor present before answering further, she said that she did not believe a solicitor would alter the substance of what she had to say, and that she preferred to have the thing done cleanly. I watched Crail's face during this recitation, and saw there, beneath the professional attention of the policeman, and something that was neither wholly condemnation nor wholly sympathy, but partook of both. The expression of a decent man confronted by a situation that his training has prepared him to process, but that his humanity receives with rather more difficulty. He completed his questions, closed his notebook, and performed his formal duty with a gravity that I respected. The others were informed separately and in turn. Hargreaves received the news with the stillness of a man who's been waiting for a particular blow so long that its arrival brings, paradoxically, something almost like relief. He said very little, and what he said was correct and measured, but his eyes as he left the room were the eyes of a man from whom a long-sustained weight had been partly, if not entirely, lifted. Colonel Bryce heard the account with his hands clasped behind his back, and his face set in the rigid composure of a soldier receiving news from the field, and when he had absorbed it, he said, quietly and without elaboration, that he was sorry, not to the room in general, but to some private accounting within himself. Mallory wept, with the uncomplicated openness of a young man who has not yet learned to manage grief behind a composed surface, and I found his tears, amid all the controlled and careful feeling of that extraordinary morning, the most honestly human thing I had witnessed in the whole of our time at Blackthorn House. Miss Clara was taken to Oxford in Crail's carriage in the early afternoon, and the departure was accomplished without ceremony. She paused at the door of the door of a house she had managed for 4 years, had effectively run for 3, and which she was leaving now under circumstances she had always known might come, and looked back at it once with an expression that I shall not attempt to render in words, and then walked to the carriage and did not look back again. Holmes and I departed Blackthorn House that same evening, our bags packed with the efficiency of men long practised in the business of departing places where difficult things have occurred. The groom who had collected us at the station on our arrival drove us back along the same 3 miles of lane, between hedgerows and harvested fields, and the beeches of the avenue stood against the darkening sky as they had stood on our arrival, stripped and still and entirely indifferent to the events that had transpired beneath them. We caught the 7 o'clock express from Wychwood Parva, and for the first hour of the journey, Holmes sat in his corner of the carriage, with his coat collar turned up and his eyes upon the window, and said nothing whatsoever, which I took as an indication that the case was still moving through him, rather than having been set down. I occupied myself with my notes, and waited, in the way I had long since learned to wait, for him to emerge from wherever he had gone. It was somewhere in the Berkshire darkness that he spoke. She was correct, said he without preface, that the law is an imperfect instrument. It is designed for the general case, not the particular one. And the general case assumes a symmetry between offence and remedy that the particular case will frequently decline to provide. He turned from the window, and in the faint lamplight of the carriage his face had the quality of a man thinking aloud, rather than addressing a companion, following his own reasoning to wherever it was leading him, regardless of where that was. Pembury used the law's indifference to shelter a systematic cruelty that the law itself had no mechanism to address. Miss Clara used its blind spot to address what the law could not. There is a logic to that which I recognise, even as I affirm that it cannot be permitted to stand as precedent. Because if it stood as precedent, I said, every person who believed their grievance sufficient would be judge and executioner in their own cause. Precisely. The law's impartiality is its strength, not merely its limitation. Remove it and you have not justice but the unregulated competition of private griefs, each one convinced of its own primacy. He was quiet for a moment, and yet, he did not complete the sentence. I did not ask him to. Some things are more honestly left at precisely that pause, at the conjunction that acknowledges the argument's full weight, without pretending that the weight is all on one side. I have set down, in the pages preceding, the facts of the Blackthorn affair as fully and faithfully as my notes and my memory together can render them. I have tried to report not only what was observed and concluded, but what was felt, because I have always believed that the cases which illuminate the nature of Sherlock Holmes most clearly are not those that display only his analytical gifts, remarkable as those gifts undoubtedly are, but those in which the application of those gifts brings him into contact with the deeper and more resistant complexities of human conduct. He is not, whatever a superficial reading of his manner might suggest, a man indifferent to those complexities. He is, rather, a man who has elected to approach them by the discipline of reason because he finds, in that discipline, the most honest available tool, while understanding, I believe, rather better than he generally allows himself to say, that the tool's honesty is not the same thing as its sufficiency. The train carried us back through the November dark toward London and Baker Street, and the familiar clutter of the rooms above Mrs. Hudson's excellent care, and I sat across from Sherlock Holmes in the lamplight and thought of a house that was orderly on its surface and troubled at its foundation, and of a woman who had done a terrible thing for reasons that the law would weigh in one scale and conscience in another, and I found that I could not, with complete honesty, tell you which scale sat lower. Perhaps that uncertainty is, itself, the most faithful conclusion I can offer.